Hi, I'm Dr. Katie VanValin, and on this week's episode of Beef Minutes, I'm going to talk about ways that we can compare different feed ingredients on a price per unit of nutrient basis in order to understand if we're actually getting a better deal when we're comparing either different sources of the same ingredient or different ingredients to one another. And I thought this was an important topic because we've been getting lots of questions about that this time of year. Feed costs are up, and I know producers are out there trying to find the most cost-effective way to get the nutrients that their cattle need. And so I want to walk you through these steps so that you can make some informed decisions when you're looking at potentially making some changes to the diet of your cattle. So our ultimate goal here is going to be to compare the feed ingredients on a price per nutrient basis, whether we're talking about crude protein or TDN or energy, depending on what that ingredient is bringing into our overall diet. So before we get started, there is some information that we need to gather. The first is the cost on a per unit basis. What does that cost for 50 pounds or per ton, depending on the type of ingredient that we're talking about and how we're going to be able to purchase it? The second thing we need to know is the moisture content or the dry matter content. However, if we know moisture, we can calculate dry matter. Lastly, we need a nutrient analysis. We don't necessarily need a full analysis, but we do at least need to know the nutrient value for that nutrient that we're basing our comparison off of. So for this example, we're going to be talking about crude protein. So I at least need to have a crude protein value. And if it's on a dry matter basis, that's great. That saves us a step. But if it's on an as-fed basis, we can calculate it if we've got that moisture content. And we'll walk through the steps that you need to take to make those calculations. Okay, so in this example, we're going to be comparing dried distillers to a modified distillers to a wet distillers grain. I was given the cost on a price per ton, and I was given the moisture value. So I was able to calculate the dry matter by taking 100 minus the moisture, and that gave us our dry matter value that you see up in that table. I was also given the crude protein values on an as-fed or an as-received basis. So now that I have that number and I know the dry matter, I can calculate the crude protein content on a dry matter basis. So this is that extra step that you might need to take if you weren't given that protein or energy value on a dry matter basis. So let's look at the dried distillers grain as an example. We've got 27% crude protein on an as-fed basis. We divide that by the dry matter as a decimal, so 0.88 for the 88%, and that gives us 30.7% crude protein on a dry matter basis. So we would do that for each of our ingredients or each of our sources. So now you'll see I've added a column to the table, and I've got those dry matter crude protein concentrations that we calculated in the last step. Now we need to convert our units, or in this case pounds, to units of dry matter. So everything here is priced on a price per ton. So that's 2,000 pounds in a ton. Looking at that dried distillers grain example, if we've got 2,000 pounds of a product that has an 88% dry matter, if we multiply that out, we're getting 1,760 pounds of dry matter per ton of dried distillers grain that we purchase. So I did that for each of our three ingredients, and you can see obviously as those ingredients get wetter, we get less dry matter in that pound or in that ton of product that we're looking at purchasing. So now we need to calculate the pounds of our nutrient per unit that we're talking about on a dry matter basis. So now we're trying to calculate the pounds of crude protein that are in that dry matter in the 1 ton of product that we're looking at purchasing. So if you take dried distillers grains, we've got that 1,760 pounds of dry matter that we calculated on the last step. We know that on a dry matter basis, it's 30.7% crude protein. So if we multiply those numbers, we're getting 540 pounds of crude protein on a dry matter basis per ton of dried distillers grains that we're purchasing. You can see that for modified, we get 300 pounds of crude protein, And for wet distillers grains, we get 220 pounds of crude protein on a dry matter basis per ton of the product that we're purchasing. So now to our last step, and that is going to be to take our cost, so in this case, our price per ton, and divide it by our pounds of protein that we're getting in that 1 ton. So for dried distillers grains, it's $248 a ton. We divide that by the 540 pounds of crude protein on a dry matter basis that we would be receiving, and that gives us 46 cents per pound of crude protein. You can see that for modified distillers grains, we actually get the same number. And then for wet distillers grains, it's a little bit cheaper at 39 cents per pound of crude protein on a dry matter basis. So again, you would do this for each of your ingredients or each of your sources so that you get to this final number and you can make a good comparison. Now, I want to talk about some other things that we need to consider. So even though in this example, wet distillers grains was cheaper than our dried distillers or our modified distillers, if we're not set up to handle a wet product and to efficiently feed out a wet product, then that may not be the best choice for our operation. We also need to think about how that ingredient fits in with our other ingredients in the diet. If we are looking at changing out dried distillers to a wet distillers, we're going to have to make sure that we do some math and get those cattle transitioned appropriately to make sure that we don't end up shorting cattle on nutrients when we make that switch, because there's such a difference in dry matter. The other thing that we always need to consider when we're looking at different ingredients on a cost per unit of protein in this example would be something like urea. Urea is usually going to be far and away cheaper on a price per pound of protein basis. However, we're limited with how much we can actually include in the diet. We're limited in the types of scenarios, the types of diets that we can utilize urea in. And so just because it's cheaper doesn't always mean it's going to be the best case scenario for our given situation. So I say all that to say that sometimes these decisions, especially if we're making a big change, really require consultation with your nutritionist to see if that new ingredient's going to work for you. But certainly if you are trying to shop around and find the best price on ingredients that might be pretty similar, these strategies, walking through these steps, will allow you to make an informed decision about what that ingredient's truly costing you relative to the nutrients that's going to provide to your cattle. I hope this helps make some of that decision making a little bit easier. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out to your local county extension office for more information. And that's been this week's episode of Beef Minutes. Thanks for joining us.